Welcome to the adventures of self. Conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people as they explore what it means to be self-expressed. Come on in. Join the adventure.
Hey there, adventurers. Welcome to episode 55 of The Adventures of Self. This is going to be a very special year-end review of all that we have created in the first year of The Adventures of Self. We've managed to create 54 episodes, and I wanted to take some time here to really piece out what we've done, and also to give you listeners who may be new to the show an idea to see what we've actually done up until now. You know, a lot of podcasts and people who listen to podcasts can think that old episodes don't really have currency anymore. As I've gone through what we've done over this past year, I realized how relevant and useful I think a lot of the shows can be if you have missed some and have thought about going back to see some. So I want to take some time to maybe explain what each show is about very briefly, and also, as I say, to review what this podcast has meant, some of the learnings we've had. So without further ado, I'm going to get into it, and we're going to go through shows in groups of 6. And just so you know, this is going to be a 2-part show episode because we just don't have enough time. It'd be too long to do this all in one sitting. So we're going to do this in 2 parts for the last 2 weeks of this year, 2021. So we started off way back when in January with episode 1 with my friend Sohel Moshki and how to live the adventure of self. And this really was setting the stage for what this show is all about. A fascinating discussion on all that this show is about. So living, what it means to actually live adventure versus some tick box exercise. And what adventure means. This idea of going on a journey, a specific choice to go on a journey and adventure into the unknown, and furthermore, that adventure of self. So ourself, yourself, myself, the what I would call little s self that you and I, that we all live in this life, and how that is actually a journey and adventure into the larger S self, a capital S self that encompasses all of us. Jung talked about the greater self. And so we play on this throughout the entirety of this season. It's the basis of the show. And we really, Sohel and I really get into what that means and how to live, how you can live the adventure of self. The next thing, the next episode 2, was with also a friend of mine, Dr. Nicole Freris, Health in the Modern Body and Modern World. And this is actually still our most popular and downloaded episode, full of amazing information. Clearly, we need to have Nicole back on. And it really, Nicole has 35 or more years experience as a medical doctor. She went to Cambridge University and spent a lot of time in traditional medicine and has made a transition into what she calls functional medicine, more holistic medicine. And although we do look at health and medicine, there's a lot in this show that is much more about the symbolism, the metaphor of health in our body, and really looking at the metaphor of disease, which we break down as dis-ease. When we're out of ease, we're out of balance. She talks about the language that the body provides to us and actually shows us, tells us where we're unhealthy, what it is that we need to learn about ourselves. And it has this alchemical sense of not only sort of as above, so below, but as without, so within. So what's happening in the outer world is actually a reflection of what's happening within each of us. And what you can do about that. There's a lot of learning about really being honest with who we are, what we're creating, not only in our own individual bodies, but the world we're creating in so many ways, right? And that's shown up, very very starkly and poignantly in the last year or so for all of us in our lives. We moved on to episode 3, which was with Agamemnon Otero, a name that sounds larger than life, and I can assure you that he is. We looked at the show Structuring Wellbeing at Scale. This was a look at how to, very, very poignant in where we are in our struggle with sustainability, what lives we're creating for ourselves at community level and also at the larger city and global level. He's worked in what could be called the nonprofit or not-for-profit sector, but actually looking at redefining what that means in today's world, and that it's not so much not-for-profit as changing the concept to a for-purpose business. And he is working on very large-scale projects in London and throughout the UK, bringing sustainability, energy, food production, all of these important, what we'd call sustainable ideas into fruition, but through community involvement, not through for-profit corporate entities, but through for-purpose community-led entities, and really changing the idea of not-for-profit, which often had a sense of how to help somebody. And it's much more of that fisherman quality that Jesus spoke about, making with somebody, teaching somebody how to do something, and that shows them how to make on their own. And one of the aspects of this show that was really interesting was seeing Agamemnon's own journey from an artist to a creator of resilience and working for organizations and creating those organizations of resilience. Next, we moved to Judith Quinn and the episode 4, Finding Your Whole Voice. So Judith, I've known for a number of years and has a background in acting. And she has used her background to become a teacher and to teach people how to stand in the wholeness, the fullness, the truth of their voice. I actually did a couple sessions with her before I started this podcast to really learn how to stand in the truth and the wholeness of my own voice. And wholeness is as much about, we have this sense of wanting to cut things off and to hide things about ourselves. And Judith shares stories about her own journey, her own adventures. And as she talks about, the scariest adventure that she's gone on is the internal journey and adventure of facing her personal demons. Sometimes we think we can kind of eliminate or ignore or put away our personal demons, but unless you face them, unless you bring them out to deal with them, they are very much there, hiding in the closet or under the bed, lurking and asserting power over you. And her message, finding your whole voice, being your whole voice, is really learning to accept all the things about yourself. Because when you do, accepting being wrong, and the things that you don't like about yourself, learning to accept that and expressing that, learning to express that actually opens up so much possibility and for your life, and your ability to stand in the fullness of who you are. Episode 5 was Creative Risk through movement and play with Donna Fallows. So Donna took her personal tragedy of starting life as a dancer, a very talented dancer, and having a huge accident in her late teens or early 20s that basically left her unable to walk and having to learn how to walk again. And for a dancer, obviously, that's the end of that career. But so be it. She learned to use that limitation, that life event, as a way to help others, to use movement, to explore movement, to explore play as a way to get into one's own creativity. She talks about leaning towards curiosity as opposed to judgment, and whether it's in health or in injury or sickness, what she's learned and noticed in her own practice and working with others is the innate wisdom held in the body, the innate wisdom that speaks to us. It was a bit of a echoing of what we'd heard in episode 2 with Nicole, and yet it was from a completely different sense of being and how to use the body's innate wisdom to bring us back to health through movement. And I know sometimes I really struggle to, can be very much in my head and struggle to be in movement. And yet when I take the time and listen to my body and use energy, the energy of expansion and contraction, it allows me to find a neutral place of understanding that allows me to step forward into creativity. The final of our first 6 episodes was with Kirsty Carr, Personal Development Meets Comedy. Kirsty set up a brand and a channel called Spiritual Jackass, and where she explored her desire and interest in comedy. And yet, although she can be very funny and very vulgar in that, it's only a vehicle for personal development and transformation. And she talks about her journey in that, leaning into fear, and that what she found in her own journey was that despite what her mind and her fears were telling her, that there was nothing to fix. There's nothing to overcome. And that when you allow for fear, when you lean into fear, this adventure of life, you never know the next door that's going to open up for you. And this was really this was actually a theme, I would say, for the first 6 episodes. It showed up again and again. Judith talked about it. Donna talked about it. This sense that by going on an adventure, we're creating things, and although we may have an idea of where we're going or what we're creating, actually, by going on an adventure, all sorts of things open up that we never, ever could have imagined. And Kirsty talks about that in her own sense of leaning into fear, meeting her own demons, stepping into comedy, and what that has opened up for her in her life. So I'll just take a moment now to pause and reflect on these first 6 episodes. We never know what's going to open up for us. I'll let you in on one of the things I learned and how I structured this podcast, which is actually, although we aired them episode 1 through 6, I actually recorded them episode 6 through 1. So we counted backwards, and the episode with Kirsty was the first episode we recorded. It's a little industry hack, so that by the time people hear the first episode you recorded, which is nervous and challenging, and you're not quite sure what's happening, it's actually the 5th or 6th or however many you decide to start with, episode that's coming out. And it was amazing for me to be recording an episode, the first episode with Kirsty, and how nervous I was, even though I was having a conversation with somebody I've known for several years. But all this led into this sense about being in the unknown, and the doors that opened up, because the reason and the way we were able to get 54 episodes on a weekly episode in a 52-week year, or even now only at 50 or 51 weeks, is because I recorded a number of it, the first 6 episodes as a block, edited all of those and released them all at once on our opening back in January. And it was all sort of planned and calculated in a sense through these first 6. I had, a couple of months to prepare and do the recordings and do the editing, and then to say, okay, fine, this is what we're going out with, these first 6 episodes. But then something quite interesting happened, because I was kind of away from the shore. I was out from the safe zone that I had created in the first 6. And I had to create episodes on a weekly basis and continue to do that. At least that was the challenge and the goal that I set for myself. So you get to a point where you are starting to rely on instinct, and you have to forge your way as you go. So a true adventure, I would say. In episode 7, I spoke with Warren Roberts in Australia about his company, Living Legacy Forest, the episode From Grief to Growth, Creating Life from Death, talks about his company creating forests from mortal, those of us who die, rather than graveyards. So rather than putting people in the ground to as a memory of them, or to as their final resting, he and his company are creating forests. And it is an amazing metaphoric discussion about what death actually is, and the place that death takes in the circle of life. That death is in fact the most important part of nature, because it signals regeneration. And it's interesting, as I sit here recording this on the 21st of December, we're at the winter solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're literally at the darkest day of the year and coming into the light. So when this will be released, we'll be 3 days into the light. And how much all of this is a metaphor and symbol for living. How is it we're choosing to live our life? This reminder that death is there, and death obviously can feel very somber. And in the world, the macro world we live in right now, I think we're very aware of what death is, and yet there is still this abject fear of it. And the reality, of course, is that we all have to face death. So what do we do with that? How can that enhance our lives here today? Check out my discussion with Warren for a really, really fascinating discussion into that concept, and how to, as we say, create growth from grief. In episode 8, we took a turn into the building industry, and I spoke to Adrian Lehman in our episode Circling the Square in Natural Building. So although we moved into the building industry, the theme was very similar to what we'd done in episode 7 with Warren. First of all, Adrian builds in the round. He's a builder and builds round structures, which has a fascinating history, and I encourage you to listen to the episode to find out more. And specifically doing that because it's part of nature. I think as Adrian says at one point, he's never come across a right angle in nature, and you see nests and trees, and the circle is a natural symbol, and it ties into what we spoke about in the episode with Warren, and yet this is a much more practical look at what it means to build in the round, what it means to sit and be in one of these structures. I've been in Adrian's round building structures. They're remarkable because all of a sudden we're out of hierarchy. Everybody has an equal place. What does that mean for how we look at ourselves, for how we look at the buildings we live in? And like so many others who have been on and will be on this show, Adrian talks about his own adventure. And it's why I had him on the show, because he didn't start out that way. He started out in a very, very different industry and different field. And as he said at one point, he had absolutely no idea where he was going and no idea what he was doing. And yet he found himself and created an opportunity that is fully in line with his sentiment and his expressive spirit. In episode 9, I spoke to a friend and fellow traveler in Africa. He was a roommate, Stuart Kerslake, the accountant, the aardvark, and the alchemist. Now, Stuart is an accountant, and I think this is one of my favorite names of our podcast episodes. It sounds like a children's book or some sci-fi, sort of children's sci-fi novel. The accountant, the aardvark, and the alchemist. And there's a reason for all those, and I really encourage you to listen to that, because there was a sense, that, well, talking to an accountant is going to be a bit boring and all about numbers, and yet, like so many other episodes, we uncovered some really, really beautiful concepts and the importance of numbers on a much more spiritual level, and how 1 becomes 2 becomes 3. And what does that mean? Well, we spoke about the oneness that exists everywhere, God or Allah or the flying spaghetti monster or spirit or whatever you want to call it, that symbolifies the universe, and how in our experience we break that down into duality. We have a me and existence, or us versus them, or this is me, this is the computer, I'm the speaker, you're the listener, and the importance of that. But that's not our stopping point, because when we take things to a higher dimension, into the third dimension, we raise our sights to the spiritual dimension. It brings in the quality of grace, which is something very dear, near and dear to Stuart's heart, and something he talks about at great length and with a beautiful passion. Episode 10 was a very interesting one for me, because up until now I had known everybody who was a guest on the show. And for episode 10, Sam Morris came on. I'd met him in a room on Clubhouse and asked him to come on the show. We seem to have a lot of similarities. And this was a very transformational episode, and for me, and a challenging one. The episode Ride the Waves Like a Zen Warrior is a reference to, first of all, Sam's company around Zen warrior training, and that warrior mentality to living, adventure, and to living a conversation, and that's what came up. We really had to, and I more than anything had to be in the unknown. We rode the wave of a conversation to the point that it naturally wanted to end, and I reached a point where, in my haste, I wanted to end the conversation, and yet we stayed with it. Sam really held space for me to stay with it, and encouraged both of us to stay with something to see what would happen. And like a wave, like the circles that we spoke about, we came back around, and what had been a lull in the tide created a new surge, a new wave that carried both of us into a place that we could not have imagined, we could not have scripted, and a beautiful new way of understanding how conversation emerges, how we actually create new learning and understanding by leaning into the unknown and assuming there's something more to connect with. Episode 11, Getting Real with Rael Andrews, was a conversation with Rael Andrews, who is a actor who'd been on many shows in American television, General Hospital for a number of years, but had done so much more. It was a very humbling experience for me. I learned a lot because as much about what this podcast meant, I have to be honest, and I don't like to admit it, but Rael had a heavy following, and there's a part of me that contacted him because I thought it would boost our ratings or increase, who we had access to, and I got a bit caught up in that, and I got a bit tripped up with that. And what I found in my conversation with him was an incredibly humble, well-meaning man who just taught me a lot about what it is that I'm doing here. Um, and Rael was very honest in talking about the the blessings that he's had in his life and his calling to actually give back, the service of giving back to others, coming from a place of love. And it really helped me in tripping up of what I wanted from something from an egoic place. Having that conversation with Rael really taught me something about what it is I wanted this podcast to be about. And so I'm actually very grateful that I had this moment of, sort of getting caught up in, say, maybe the social media numbers or thinking that somebody else was going to, I was going to ride on somebody else's coattails to some concept of success. And it really taught me to be in the conversation. This show is about conversations. And it really showed me that when I'm out of that, the show, the quality of what I'm offering and what we're creating here goes out the window. In episode 12, I spoke to Lindsay Bouvier about discovering the unique message within. And I'm very grateful for this conversation because Lindsay was, in a way, instrumental in helping this show, this podcast come together. Lindsay's an amazing branding expert, but using intuitive knowledge to create brand, and particularly standing in and expressing your truth. So a bit of a reflection or update on what we spoke with Judith, but from a totally different perspective, from how you put yourself out there. And, I certainly had this assumption that, branding and PR and media and all these things are kind of evil or bad in themselves. Yet, we see in social media, we're all brands. We all have this image that we put out there. And so the question really becomes, well, what is your message? What do you stand for? And more importantly, how do you relay that? That showed up again in a later episode, but what is your message? And Lindsay, as I say, was instrumental in helping me with my company message, with helping me craft the message for this show. So we really get into that and learning to stand in your truth, learning to stand for what it is you want and creating a full sense of self around that. And then, of course, the challenges that come from that. I was just talking about the episode with Rael, how easy it is to verge off of that and what we can do to bring us back on point, to bring us back on brand, what it is your brand is. And I know it sounds a bit trite, but it is a very interesting way to look at whatever it is you're putting out in the world. So that brings us to the end of episode 12. And what I started at this point to realize was learning this format, what it means to be hosting and producing a podcast. Now, for anybody out there listening, thinking to do their own podcast, or if you already are, it is an incredible amount of work, right? It's not, you end up running absolutely everything. So jack of all trades. And having done that for, whatever, at that point, 12 episodes, I really started to think about what was useful and what what I was good at and what I wasn't good at, and whether I wanted to be doing all these things. Somebody I know said that, in business or whatever you're doing, you're either spending time or you're spending money. And I was spending time, and it was not a good use of my time. So editing shows in particular was taking a lot of time and effort. I'm very grateful and that I learned the skills of learning Audacity and how to put an intro together, how to edit the individual shows, how to manage any glitches in the audio, and be very on top of that experience and be in charge of it. But that's not my skill, and it's not what I want to do. Otherwise, I guess that's what I would have studied. And so I ended up hiring an engineering firm to help me with the audio, the editing, and creating a number of other assets. So all the show notes, a number, how we broke up the quote blocks, and the video clips and the audio clip that show up on social media. I was able to sort of expand and more than double my capacity by bringing somebody in an organization that actually had the skills necessary and the experience, much more so than I did, to leverage what I was doing much more. And it really allowed me to focus on the message, as I was talking about with Lindsay. What is my message? And to focus on that rather than learning what it meant to be an audio engineer, although that's interesting in itself. But it's not what I'm called to do. And to really, as I say, focus on the message, and to get into a rhythm. And that's what started, I'd say, with episode 13. And it started also, although there were a number of people I knew in the first 12 episodes, and mostly through the first 9. Starting in episode 13, I was speaking with people I did not know. And that kind of went on for quite a while. So it's finding a new rhythm. For episode 13, I spoke with a fellow coach, Dan Warburton, who is the author of Dream It, Choose It, Live It, and the episode Living the Dream. We had a very same, different approach to life and coaching, but that wasn't what I think is interesting to me in this, and what I want to relay here is that by getting into the rhythm of this podcast, what I noticed is you meet up with allies. There is this kind of same, different message that help you reinforce your message, acknowledging, and one of the things that Dan really spoke about and it showed up was, acknowledging whatever your possibility is and being responsible for you. And the conversation, like, it was in a way we were kind of upping and supporting each other in our own message, and yet we're coming at things from slightly different angles. So there is still it's like having a conversation with somebody who you've never met but who does things very similarly as you, and seeing where things are a little bit different, exploring that, and emphasizing the things that bond you together with that person. Episode 14 is one of the most beautiful episodes I've had. I met Danny Levin also on Clubhouse, and I remember feeling quite nervous about contacting him. He seemed a much bigger character than other people I'd spoken with. He's the author of the book The Mosaic, and the episode Finding the Self Within Life's Mosaic is a look into what this means to be part of a mosaic. And Danny's language and message was very similar to what I spoke about in terms of my play on little s self and big S self, and how each little piece in the mosaic is necessary to make up the larger whole. Danny's a wonderful man and really comes from a place of love, and a focus on that one beautiful self that is all. In particular, Danny talks about his own experience about learning through conflict, learning through disagreement, learning through misunderstanding. And where that all starts is in the power of listening. So there are actually a few moments in that conversation from memory where there is profound silence, and yet the power that allowed each of us to connect with ourselves in a deeper sense and to each other. Um, Episode 15 was with gold medalist, UK Paralympic gold medalist Karen Dark. And the episode Finding the Inner Gold. This was, Karen's got quite an amazing story, and it really sort of was otherworldly to hear her experience about her program, Quest 79. And you might ask, well, why 79? Well, go listen to the episode and see why 79 is an important number for Karen, and has been and continues to show up in her life, and what she has created with her limitation. You know, I also learned quite a bit in this episode. It was a very humbling episode for me. As I said, Karen's a Paralympic gold medalist, and had an accident in her late teens or early 20s that left her paralyzed from the waist down. And I had this sense, a bit naively, that, you know, I really wanted to ask her and wanted answers of, well, what, you know, how could she go on to be an Olympic gold medalist, and how she had overcome all these difficulties. And I think I was really trying, you know, I don't have that experience, and I was trying to put something onto her, project something onto her, a capacity, a quality that, to her credit, she sort of shunned or pushed away. And repeatedly she said, you know, I'm nothing special. I'm nothing special. And it was a real, you know, lesson into what it means that somebody is able to do something that to me seems, you know, quite remarkable. Not only winning gold medals, but traveling across continents and climbing mountains and swimming and skiing and all these amazing things with a physical limitation that to her was just a condition, a circumstance, not a limitation per se. It was just, you know, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, or you know, it's just a condition, not a limitation. So a very inspiring and beautiful conversation with Karen. We stayed with the concept of movement, but from somebody who brings movement into all aspects of his life. Phil Holford talks about movement as a way to heal the body. Our episode, The Power of Presence, brings his awareness of being in the body and sort of being a lifelong monkey naturally, you know, from growing up in the wilds of South America, swinging from trees, to becoming part of one of Britain's most prestigious dance troupes, to then breaking out on his own and finding his own path and finding his own rhythm in dance and movement. It was really interesting to explore. There was a lot of vulnerability in this episode. I met Phil through a men's circle, and it's something I'd like to bring more into these episodes and the show, because we both had a sense of what it means to be vulnerable, and as a man, a willingness to share where challenges are, share where we're struggling, not to have somebody else fix it, but just because by getting it off one's chest, it it actually creates a space for things to open. So that is what really got out of that episode. Into episode 17, amplifying your authentic messages in life with Tracy Lamourie. Now, Tracy has been building brand with public and media relations for herself and clients for dozens of years. And it was a different reflection than I'd gotten from Lindsay about brand. This was much more about like how to put your message out there, and what it means to be creating an authentic message. Tracy had brought to experience what it meant to be sure of something and to stay on message. She had been involved in a 20-year campaign to get somebody off of death row, somebody that she'd never met. She was living in Canada. Somebody was on death row in the US. She'd heard about something, don't even remember how she made the connection, and then spent 20 years working with them and creating an authentic message that eventually showed that this man who was on death row was completely innocent, and he eventually got released. And it was very inspiring to see that ability to take a skill and apply it to something that, on the one hand, really had nothing to do with Tracy's day-to-day job, but it was a heart calling, and something that actually propelled her further into public and media relations. Her ability to win something for this man actually showed her and taught her how to do this for others. She had a great message as well, which I think was a great message for me in this podcast, which is that half of everything is showing up and doing it. We have such a sense of, and I certainly do, of being a perfectionist. I started and stopped this podcast recording 2 or 3 times before I got into the rhythm, just because, I didn't like how it started. And I think eventually I said, I'm just going to go, and we learn along the way. And it's something I offer to you all, that show up and do it rather than plan for it. And in that, bring us to episode 18, was my conversation with Charles Collins. Creating a masterpiece of your life. He is the author of the Life Craft book series. And I really enjoyed this conversation because it took me back to aspects of my own life, working as an apprentice blacksmith several decades ago, 3 decades. And he overlays the centuries, if not millennia old tradition of learning a craft, whether it's a blacksmith or cobbler or I don't know, whatever else. And how, though traditionally these skills that have been, passed down generation after generation, communities all over the world had a very specific model to them, that, we go from apprenticeship to mastery and then on to mentorship. And that this is a model for how we can live our lives and in various aspects of our lives. This is really a guide for organizing our life. And it also underlies something that, I talk about from the work I do in creative consciousness, and the intuitive coaching that I do. One of the things we say about creating, and a very specific aspect of creating through consciousness, is that creating is, one definition of creating is making connections that have not been made before. And I really enjoyed having this conversation with Charles, who brought this model of apprenticeship and mastery in the traditional hard crafts of guilds and building into how to live your life, that you can use this model, this template, to, as I say, as a model, as a guide for how to live your life. So at this point, we've done 18 shows, and I remember speaking to a very good friend of mine. In fact, it was Sohel, the guest on episode 1, who helped me a lot with the development of this show, and really thinking about finding my voice and whether this show really had anything to offer. There was this a sense of, I really started to doubt and bring in a critical judgment and whether what I was doing was any good. And Sohel offered something to me that really helped at this stage of the podcast, and it's came right on the heels of the episode with Charles around your life, creating your life as a masterpiece, and this apprenticeship, and seeing that for some period of time in the beginning, it may feel a little clunky, and I stand by the value particularly as I look back now on the guests that we had on the show, and I know that one of the reasons I'm offering this episode as a year-end review is to highlight how amazing each of these episodes were. I do give myself credit for bringing on amazing guests, but also there's a learning experience, and there's a part of us that wants to be at the end, that wants to be the master, and not necessarily go through the steps of apprenticeship and journeyman and getting to that stage of mastery. And I remember Sohel said, well, let's look at the first 50 or 60 episodes, for instance, as practice. When you're learning to drive, you don't just go immediately to take your driver's license. You take some lessons and you practice. And when you want to, be a musician in a band, you don't just stand up from day one on stage. You take time to practice your guitar or piano or whatever it is. So this, at this point, it was really learning about honing the message, covering different ground, that's what I was learning, was how to be okay with not having everything perfect, and yet still having an end result in mind, still focused on what it is that we are creating, mindful that it may not always be perfect. So into episode 19, I had a conversation with author Dan McCrory, who wrote Capitalism Killed the Middle Class. And the episode, The Ever-Changing World, was very interesting to me. I mean, in a way, we hadn't had anybody who had a much more political message in the book he wrote as much on the show. We were focused more on people's individual stories. And yet I had Dan on, and what was interesting to me was to see how he'd used his own experience in labor and his working career, because what he'd learned in that was the basis of his book, Capitalism Killed the Middle Class, and from an American perspective, but I think it's true in the world today, and we see the effects and impacts of this. And what it showed me, and we've had quite a few authors on the show, but Dan's experience of, from a much more nonfiction point of view, of using experience in labor to write and fight for what he believes is right. And this shows up again and again, because this idea of your authentic message and how you get that across. The other thing is, Dan's a number of years older than me, and he really talked about his sense of duty and desire to pass things on to the next generation, sharing his lessons, his experience, because what he saw was the relevance of his experience to youth and people today going through their own challenges of trying to create and carve out a successful career or life, maybe just in the middle class. And in particular, that words, the impact that words have on life and history. Moving into episode 20, I had Angel Ribot on, and we had an episode, Listening and Speaking with the Heart. Angel goes by the name the CEO Confident, and there's a reason for that. He'd had experiences working with and supporting over 1,500 CEOs in his career. And yet, what happened in this episode almost had nothing to do with that business experience. He and I both had significant business corporate background, and yet we both had come to very spiritual approaches and understandings in the world. And this conversation really, the episode is what it says on the tin, listening and speaking with the heart. And we focus on the reason that that we've gone from a corporate experience into a more holistic way of working with people is because we have opened our own hearts, and we have learned to not only speak from our hearts, but probably more important, to listen with our hearts. And again, there's some profound silences in this episode, because what I found, and you can reflect on this yourself, is in conversation, it's not always just a string of people talking over each other, or if it is, it's probably not a very instructive or transformational conversation where nobody's really learning anything. We're just sort of trying to get our point across. And yet when we actually really stop to listen, we open up new possibilities for ourselves. We connect with things that we hadn't allowed as a possibility. Really listening to somebody else, which I think is very, very critical and needed in our world today, shows us how we can actually speak from our own heart, because we just want to be heard. We just want to be listened to. And it's not about getting it being right. It's about this give and take of listening and speaking. And I think the ultimate message from this was not about going outside, our corporate experience and the life that we've led, but really it's about going within. We speak about meditation and the ability to, what it means to really listen in silence to others. This moved us quite well into episode 21 with Akello Stone, also an author, the author of Seeking, really getting some quite a bit in saliva in the mouth or something. Anyway, he's the author of Seeking Selfdom in the Age of Selfies. It's like she sells seashells by the seashore. The episode 21, An Adventure of Selfdom. So Akello was one of these sort of brother from another mothers that I had the pleasure to meet quite, randomly. I don't even remember how we came across each other. And yet we had a fascinating and amazing conversation, and very similar approach to things, but very different backgrounds. Akello is a professor of, I think, sociology out in California, and fascinated by human behavior, looking and having both an objective and a subjective study. So he applied a study of himself um, to his rigor as an academic, and really looked at, what it means that we are seeking this concept of selfdom. What does that mean? We're seeking selfdom, and yet we're in this age of selfies where, selfdom actually is that deeper going within that belies our appearance, and yet we are caught in this social media world of selfies and putting a paper thin or digital image of us that represents the fullness of who we are, and reflecting on what that means and reflecting on who we are and the people that show up in our lives. We also have a really deep discussion about the meaning of compassion. In episode 22, I spoke to sustainability designer, Elena Grigoriou. The episode Designing Sustainability and Wellbeing for the Soul. So in a way, this could be seen as a more intimate update from the conversation I'd had with Agamemnon back in episode 3, which looked at well-being and at scale on the city or global level. And Alina is an interior designer, but really focusing on sustainability and well-being, and looking at what it means, how to create well-being for ourselves in our built environment, in our structures, and what that means for us individually, psychologically, emotionally, physically. She wrote a book, Wellbeing in Interiors: Philosophy, Design, and Value in Practice. And it's an interesting, again, metaphoric discussion, because although we do talk about her practice of designing buildings and interiors, it really is about your interior. What are you designing? The interior that you're designing, because the interior of a building supports our levels of comfort, our emotional, our mental, our physical levels of comfort. And you may reflect on certain buildings or environments that make you feel happier or more anxious, or more at peace. And so we do that in our built environment, and there is an opportunity to create more sustainable environments, and environments that encourage or facilitate personal and collective well-being. And yet we also have the opportunity to do that for ourselves, for our own interiors. We actually can be our own interior designers of life. That moves us on to episode 23 with Jim Shupak. And these last two episodes from this round were really profound for me. They really had a huge impact. Jim Shupak, this episode, Overcoming the 100-Day Ordeal. Jim talks very openly about his battle with depression, and how he overcame that. The steps he did to overcome a serious bout of depression in his life. And it's a very simple message, but simple things can be very impactful. This is not, this show is about conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people. And I think Jim would be the first to admit he's an ordinary person. And yet he is on his own adventure of self-discovery and self-expression. And what that means and how to do that. Because we can think of all the things that, these inventors or artists or these kind of multinational media personalities that we see and can see great stories, and yet there are millions or billions of us who are overcoming small challenges day in, day out. And the conversation with Jim really highlights, gets into the granularity of what it means, the day-to-day means of really starting from where you are, and how the day you have starts by putting 2 feet on the ground, And the journey you're on, the adventure you choose to be on, starts by putting one foot in front of the other. There's a great deal of openness and vulnerability in this episode. In episode 24, I spoke with Ryan Nurse about the importance of being present. Ryan's become a bit of a media personality these days, and rightfully so. He has an amazing message and an amazing personality. From his late teens, he had a near-death experience that left him in a coma and nearly dead. And from that, he rebuilt himself to create a full life, and went through another personal crisis and rebuilt from that. He has an amazing awareness of what it means to create his life. I think there are many common tales about people who've had near-death experiences who have a fuller appreciation for life and actually how to live it. One of the things that and Ryan has great quips and ways of capturing things, life and opportunities in very poignant, simple, direct messages, and how, for instance, it is better to try and fail than to fail to try. Talks about people regretting their inactions rather than the actions that they have taken, and goes through his own experience in that. He's a fellow adventurer and traveler. He's traveled probably as much as, if not more than me. And so there's this real sense about what it means to go out on these physical adventures, geographical adventures into the world and exploring new countries and new lands, but really how, wherever you go, there you are. So really the adventure, although those adventures out in the world can inform you, it's as much about the adventure of yourself, because when you get home from the vacation, you've still got to deal with yourself, or you get home from the journeys and adventures, you still have to deal with yourself. And so how can those adventures out there inform you of how to live your life? So let's take another quick break here to talk about what it meant to move into episode 25. I really considered this a bit of a milestone. I mean, it's sort of artificial. Don't even remember what 25th anniversary is, but this felt like a milestone at this point. And I should say as well that the last, I've done these in sort of blocks of 6. And when I was preparing for this, I noticed that from episode 12 through 24, I didn't know anybody. I had not met anybody, or nobody was a friend. I may have met them online and had a quick conversation, but this 12 to 24 episodes were really about, finding a new voice and stepping out more into the unknown. And I really felt this sense around episode 25 to acknowledge what I'd created. Not that we weren't going to, continue or meet new people, but this sense of acknowledging what I'd created. Maybe it gave me a little time to breathe and pause and think, okay, what is this? We were gaining a following, even if it was step by step. And to really think, what is this about? Why am I doing this? I definitely was aware of, I mentioned it back on episode 11, I definitely was aware of chasing social media numbers. Do we have enough followers or enough people liking our posts and all of that? And I think this milestone really got me to reflect, well, why am I doing this? Why put out a podcast? I mean, it's certainly not to make money. Don't know if anybody else out there has tried podcasting. Some people like Joe Rogan can make hundreds of millions. The rest of us do it because we love it. Yeah. And so that's it. Am I doing this to get followings, to get this sort of adulation from outside, or because it's true, right? The message of what it is that we chose to bring to this show, highlighting and bringing in these conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people about the adventures of their lives, right? As they seek to what it means to be self-expressed in this world. I'm fascinated by this as much for my own development and journey and adventure as to learn from others, to hear from others, and for those of you, the listeners, to engage you, to entertain you, to inspire you on your own adventures. This sense of, and I think the thing that I really got was around this time was that we are growing, but we never stop, and we are learning, and hopefully we never stop learning, and the sense that although there are, there's some things that I wanted to get out of it, when you continue on a path like this, and when you set up a structure that that allows for this growth and learning, so much more comes. So the connections, the ability to put something like this out, to speak publicly, to express myself, to hone my message, to work on social media, to promote, to learn how to edit software, to edit audio using new software. There are all these learnings that kind of the soft skills that were not expected, that were not intended in a way, and yet come along with this creation. So episode 25, I had a very special guest, and back to somebody I know, Alice Mabin, on the episode Through the Eye of a Lens. And Alice's story is one of those extraordinary stories. She's the author of 4 photography books, thick, heavy, and not just pretty books, but really telling stories, gritty tales about farming, agriculture, cattle drives, and outback life in Australia, and her own personal autobiography, The Winding Road. And I've met Alice in Africa a couple of years ago, and she was such a natural person for me to want to have on the show, because she's the epitome of creative living. And somebody I'd met with my mentor, William Whitecloud, and who actually, through Alice's prompting, helped me decide to have on as the guest on episode 50. So there's some nice sort of, whatever that is, synchronicity of the numbers in that. Alice, as I say, has just regaled me with tales of amazement, adventure, and inspiration. Similar to Ryan, she'd had a near-death experience and never looked back. She's been living her life to the absolute fullest, her whole life, and certainly since she was in a coma in her late teens. And she also talks about the struggle, but the challenge of being a woman working in heavy agriculture, heavy industry, construction, and big farming, and how that, similar to Karen Dark, is only a limitation if you define it as such. And Alice never did, and she rose to the top of that, and then created, against the advice and willingness of even other photographers, created a professional photography career on her own, by herself. In episode 26, I had a calling. I mentioned earlier that my conversations with Jim Shupak and Ryan Nurse in episodes 23 and 24 had a profound impact on me. And they both spoke about depression and what they had done to overcome those challenges. And I really felt a calling to speak about my own experience. It really, sometimes you just feel an urge to do something, and regardless of the fear, regardless of the vulnerability of it, I really had a sense that I had to put out a solo episode. And it was we called it a self-care adventure. And I looked at my own and detailed my own experience in depression, but what I had done in a number of ways, hopefully that can be of service to anybody out there, of how to deal with depression, how to deal with these challenges that many of us face, that can feel very, very heavy internal battles. And as I say, I was really inspired by others to step into this, and it helped me. I said, like, one of the things about this time was I started to get more than I expected from things, and so my willingness and stepping into the fear of being on a recording and a podcast, just me, was a new step for me. I really had a sense up until then that I was kind of playing second fiddle and could play a good complement to other amazing people, and shied away from my own experience, from my own story. Not to toot my own horn, but I think we all have something to share. I think everybody, the part of the point of this podcast is we all have an adventure of self-expression, of self-discovery, and I would love more than anything that whatever 7-8 billion of us were on that adventure, fully, wholly, really, really in it for ourselves. And stepping into recording this episode was really a challenge for me, and yet it showed me, it allowed me to sort of put my money where my mouth is and be vulnerable, and to, not for the sake of getting pity or anything like that, but to inspire, to share, and that vulnerability is not weakness. The other thing it helped is sort of like helped me to reach out to others, to be a guest on other people's podcasts, and as my sister said, OPP, and see that, not that it's like this humbling sense of, well, I do have something to share, and I hope that I can be of service to others in their journey. So episode 27 was another deep and profound one with Alex Boyangu, a psychologist by Western training, and a almost lifelong devotee of meditation by Eastern training and tradition. This episode, Shaping a New Consciousness, we really get into the challenges and the differences between Eastern and Western philosophy, and what it means to the Western philosophy of separation and dualism that I spoke about with my episode with Stuart Kerslake, episode 9, how letting go of that sense of separation allows us to experience the intimacy of the now. So it's actually kind of going rather from 1 to 2 to 3, but from going to 2 to 1. So break, and even maybe to 0. Breaking down this concept of separation that we all feel, separation from loved ones, separation from ourselves, separation from society, and seeing that is all an illusion. This one of the things that Alex talks about is the almost farce of thinking that we are isolated, thinking that we are an island unto ourselves. This is, how can we be anything but connected to everybody? How can we be anything but connected to the universe? We, in our minds, learn or assume that we are separate. Look around, we are all connected. This whole universe, this whole life is one big seamless thread, one big mosaic, one capital S self. In episode 28, I spoke to Georgie Holbrook, the episode Authentic Expression. Georgie's the author of 4 books and a musician, but she wasn't always that. She talks about healing hidden and maybe not so hidden traumas. So Georgie talks about her journey from a corporate executive for years, almost a couple decades, into the sickness that brought up in her, physical, emotional sickness that disfigured her. And regardless of the medications and the other treatments that people suggested, there was no cure for what she had until she healed herself, until she went in and healed her own trauma, her own emotional trauma. There was no way for her, to recover. And it's something that now she's teaching others, the ability to listen to and use the body's language for healing. And you can hear now that this is something that's shown up again and again, that on this adventure, we actually have the ability to guide ourselves, to heal ourselves along the way. And often it is by meeting our demons, by facing the things that challenge us, and learning to rely on and listen to our own innate wisdom and knowledge to get to that place of healing and fullness of expression that, as I said, launched Georgie into writing 4 books and being a musician in her own regard. In episode 29, I spoke to Pat Lyons, who is an incredibly successful business owner. And our episode, Success Through Coaching, talks about our similar experiences coaching with William Whitecloud, and the success that he's had through that. I mean, Pat was a very successful recruiter in the UK, and ultimately unhappy with that, and built a business consultancy, a global award-winning business consultancy that has helped more than 50 companies in amazing transformations. Burberry and Sky TV and Argos, which is a big provider of home goods in the UK, and this ability to work with, people talk about change management, but how to do that effectively and actually serve your client, your corporate client, so that you're winning awards, when you're a relatively small consultancy and outpacing all the others, is a testament to Pat's willingness to deal with his own limitations or assumed limitations, and to use those as fuel for learning, and his ability to understand the HR and recruiting landscape, but to see it from the inside and to work with the teams and the organizations to understand what they need from something. A deep understanding of what companies need is what has propelled him into great success, great business success, and personal success. And Pat has a very practical sense, because he's in business. He's there doing the work. He's not just sitting around meditating. He's using his understanding of consciousness, his understanding of how business works, his understanding of how we face challenges, and how to overcome those, how to actually translate those into success, personal success, and corporate or organizational success, and the value of something like coaching to get you to where you want to be, or an organization as to where it wants to be. So I'm going to end this first part of the review, with episode 30, which is useful because in a way it kind of completes the circle here in this first review. I had a conversation with Scott Gazzoli called Causing the Effect, and he's the podcast host of Causing the Effect. It's one of the first podcasts. In fact, it may have been the first other podcast I was on. And this is another one of those sort of bizarro moments where I saw in Scott a younger version of me, and I think he saw in me an older version of himself, or an older possibility of himself. And we have these kind of similar, weird, but quite opposite experiences of our fathers that we get into, quite wild tales of cocaine and drugs and prison and adventure that was passed down to each of us individually. And we also talk about, we have very similar experience in that we were both started into this quest for money, this quest for, or maybe not me money so much, but corporate acknowledgement and corporate achievement, and how that can ultimately be unfulfilling. So what do we do with that, right? What do you want to be in life? What do you want to create for yourself? And how that journey within informs ultimately what it is that you want to create with your life, and how to share that with others. So Scott talks about that in the experience with his business. And we both talk about it in the experience of our podcasts, what it means to be a mentor for people, younger than us or with less experience than us. And how what shows up for you, what shows up in the world, I should say, for you is a reflection of who you are. So that kind of brings us to an end of this, first review. Next week we'll finish up the last 24 episodes we've had. And to say, I wanted to do this first of all as for my own sake, to have a review of what I've created over this year. And if any of these episodes speak to you, I really, they're there. They're available for you. They're not stuck in the past somewhere. They're present, and they are meant to be timeless. Very few episodes talk at all about current events. Maybe one or two talk about the month that they were recorded, but the idea is that these are timeless conversations that really get into what it means to be on this adventure of self. So I'm going to leave it there for this week. Thank you for listening. And as we move into next week, we'll close out this year. We'll close out what this year has meant for the Adventures of Self podcast and where we're going to be going into season 2. So thanks for listening, and we will see you all next week. Happy adventures.